And to segue to Dante, I think Dante can help us with this. He might seem strange to reach all the way back to the 13th century and to talk about this great figure who's often celebrated for the Divine Comedy as the kind of culmination of the medieval worldview. But actually, I've become persuaded that Dante realized that the medieval worldview was already changing. And so he wrote the Divine Comedy in order to develop the new kinds of intelligence that were needed for what was to become the modern world. He himself was born at the beginning of the Renaissance. The human individual as a figure was becoming more and more important. He lived in the beginnings of mercantile times when the predecessors to modern capitalism were beginning to shape society. Machines were becoming more present. Things like windmills and so on were starting to shape the countryside. And I think he realized that things were starting to change very dramatically, very fundamentally, and so wrote the Divine Comedy for the future, not for the past. For example, he's the first Italian to use the word modern. I think even the first person to use the word modern in the sense that we mean it now. A condition of mind that looks to the future rather than one that draws on the past. He recognized that he lived in between times, you might say. And so wrote the Divine Comedy to educate himself as well as share that insight through this experiential journey, replete with images and the use of poetry, of course, for his peers and also his successors. It's a human story as well, as all spiritual intelligence is. The minute particulars, as William Blake realized, are where wisdom and intelligence really lies, not the abstract in general, which inevitably distance us from that which they try to describe. And as you can see in the image on the left there, Dante's own journey began with falling in love with Beatrice on the streets of Florence. Love awoken in him in that moment and became the great question of his life. And of course, Beatrice becomes one of his guides in the Divine Comedy. And so he goes on this great journey, which I've written about in my book. And this is the sketch of the journey. We're not going to go on the whole thing tonight. There wouldn't be time. But I wanted to at least to get this sense, if this is probably familiar already. But he begins with the descent into hell that's at the bottom of the diagram there, having woken up midway through the course of our life in the dark wood. And then there's a great moment where they begin the ascent, and first up Mount Purgatory, and then through the heavenly spheres into the Empyrean itself, into the zone of the divine presence unalloyed. And what I wanted to do this evening was pick up on just a couple of moments in the Inferno and the Purgatorio, but then mostly think about the Paradiso and try and show how through Dante's encounters, through the imagery, he can stir in us a conscious realization of what spiritual intelligence can be. And so I hope secure in us a clear and distinct sense of why that's valuable, that I think is going to be important in an age where AI is becoming more pervasive. There's a need sort of to resist, a need for ethics for sure. But I think ultimately we can't be Canute-like, hoping to resist the oncoming tide. What we have to do is transcend that altogether and recover a much richer sense of our humanity. There's various ways of doing this, and I think Dante can be a great guide. And there's a reason why somehow, strangely, he's still read 700 years on. He's got something of our humanity that certainly in the Western Christian world might speak to us yet. So, a first image. Here's a woodcut of Dante waking up in the dark wood on the left there, and he encounters Virgil, who's going to be his great guide for the first part of the journey, first two parts of the journey. But what Virgil tells him straight away is something very strange. Virgil tells him that he has been sent to Dante by, Beatrice who has been sent by St. Lucy, the angel of light, who herself has been sent by the Virgin Mary. And the figure of Mary is going to become very important to Dante at the end. But although Dante knows that light and love and the heavenly realms, the saints, are there to guide him, he still must go first through the descent of the Inferno. And you can see on the right there, the gates of hell, with per me, through me, abandon hope, all who enter, and all that. So this is something which spiritual intelligence understands, that descent is actually part of ascent, that darkness is part of the way to understanding light, that the negative emotions, envy, vengeance, hate, all the so-called vices, they need to be understood if the strength and power of the virtues is to really become embedded in us. And, this is a very hard thing to learn, but spiritual intelligence knows somehow it's true. And it's the first thing that Dante must trust Virgil with, that he has to go through the gates of hell in order to then be able to know the light more fully. He doesn't really trust Virgil in this moment. He starts to realize quite what that's going to mean. And he complains and he resists and he tries to make excuses, as we do. But there's something about this descent being linked to the ascent that is fundamental to any kind of spiritual intelligence. And if you know other spiritual literature, you'll know that that same pattern is there. It's in Plato, for one thing. Plato I know fairly well. And Dante has to learn it now. The way up and the way down are part and parcel of the one way. Another thing that he learns when he's in the Inferno, just to touch on another moment, there are many moments of great crisis in the Inferno. Here's one of the wonderful pictures by Gustave Doré, which shows them before the gates of Dis, one of the regions that they have to enter on their journey. And what happens is quite surprising, is that a great angel appears to open the doors. And this is something else which spiritual intelligence can begin to trust, that it's not just about me and my psyche, me and my emotional intelligence, me and my therapy and understanding myself and others, although that's immensely valuable and kind of necessary. I work as a psychotherapist, because you can get trapped at that level of understanding and intelligence if you don't have emotional intelligence. But you also know through spiritual intelligence that there are other entities, there are other beings, there's grace, there's all sorts that you can call on. And if you can learn how they work and how they speak, they can be integrated into this path as well. Spiritual intelligence knows that. And Dante begins to get a sense of that, because when he's in the darkest places in the Inferno, things he just hadn't expected at all can happen. It doesn't take away him experiencing the darkness. This isn't spiritual bypassing. And in fact, the angel opens the gate of Dis so they can descend more fully into the Inferno. It can work that way as well. But nonetheless, there's more going on than perhaps we initially realize. And then there's maybe the most extraordinary moment in the whole of the Inferno. Here's one of Botticelli's images showing Lucifer, the fallen seraphim, who's right at the center of the Inferno. And you can see Botticelli does this wonderful cartoon thing showing Virgil and Dante moving across the surface of the paper from the right there and then onto Lucifer's body and then down. And this is one of the great reveals of the Inferno, that the way to transcend the darkness is not to sort of have a look and then turn your back on it and walk away again to the light. It's to go right to the heart of darkness until you can go no further. And then you find the extraordinary thing that there's a turnabout and an antiodromia, as Carl Jung put it. And this is shown in Dante's extraordinary image of how they had to climb onto the very body of Lucifer. They couldn't get closer if they tried. And even as they got so close, they thought they were lost. The turnaround comes and they suddenly realize that they're actually now starting to ascend They're not descending anymore. Something that spiritual intelligence can know, can trust. Even emotional intelligence, I think, struggles with this. Dante starts to fall apart emotionally at this stage. But luckily, Virgil, his guide, informed by the heavenly guides, knows to keep going. And that's a very profound part of this as well, I think. In the Christian dispensation, this is Good Friday coming before Easter Sunday. The Buddhists often say the obstacles are the way. It's picked up in different traditions of spiritual intelligence. So look, we've leapt on a bit. They're now up Mount Purgatory, and the present moment returns in Mount Purgatory, which means there's day and night. And I wanted to draw attention to the first night on Mount Purgatory in particular. And the reason for this is that it brings about another extraordinary juxtaposition that spiritual intelligence can understand, and I think others can't. It's a complete paradox, a sort of contradiction even. And on the left there, you can see an image, a Michelangelo image of Zeus in the form of the eagle abducting Ganymede, the beautiful youth, to take him to Mount Olympus and stand beside his throne to be his cupbearer. And on the first night of his time on Mount Purgatory, Dante has this dream. He dreams of Zeus abducting to rape Ganymede. And he realizes that this dream, the myth, has come from his own psyche. And so he wakes up absolutely horrified. He thought that he was beginning the ascent, that there'd been the turnabout in his spiritual journey. And yet he's still having these most foul, dark of thoughts. And he wakes up distressed. What's this going to take? How long must this go on for? What darkness is there still to appear? And yet, if you look to the right, he can see William Blake's sketch drawing from this canto of the Purgatory, Canto 9, you can see it there at the bottom. And Virgil tells him, Dante, that actually what happened when he was dreaming was that St. Lucy appeared and carried him a bit further up the mountain, came to his aid. And I think what this is saying is that our dreams, for sure, but also maybe other things that happen to us in life that feel unbearable, that feel like suffering, that feel like darkness, are actually us being carried further up the mountain. They're still part of our ascent. And Dante begins to learn to trust that a bit more. He can now, as it were, consciously go towards what's dark, trusting that it's part of the purgation of himself. And purgation here doesn't mean sort of removing what is bad. Often purging is seen in that way. I think what it actually means, and Dante begins to understand this, is removing that which veils our capacity to see more clearly. It's a cleansing process in that sense. And so a veil is actually lifted when he sees the darkness within himself more fully, and that's a precursor to a veil being lifted where he can see the light more fully as well. Again, these things that one kind of intelligence would just see as a complete contradiction, spiritual intelligence can understand. Another way that this might be put is that the tragedy of the Divine Comedy is starting to be contained by the comedy. And this is the old sense of the word comedy, which doesn't just mean sort of wit in the sense of laughter. It means wit in the sense of wisdom. And sometimes the two come together, of course. But the comedy, which is a resolution that contains delight, that is able to say yes to life and yes to life and yes to life again, is able, therefore, to embrace the tragedy. And with that embrace, to transcend it. That's the kind of dynamic that Dante's learning here, that our spiritual intelligence can know as well. He then climbs up the 7 terraces of Mount Purgatory. Again, people may well know this, and each of the terraces is devoted to one of the so-called deadly sins. But Dante is always changing the kind of Purgatory 101 theological teachings. And what he realizes is that the figures who are carrying these great weights on their back when they encounter their pride, what they're having to learn is that they also need a certain kind of pride in order to make the ascent. But what they must tease out is the difference between vaingloriousness on the one hand and self-dignity on the other. And those two kinds of pride are often in our lives deeply intertwined. You know, how to know whether we're being dignified or just a bit vainglorious is often not at all straightforward. And that's another thing that spiritual intelligence, I think, understands, that staying with something is a crucial part of untangling and therefore becoming liberated from something. And so that's what these figures are learning, is that virtue and vice are often deeply connected. But by becoming more intelligent about them, the way up, a freedom, greater liberty, a lightness, as actually literally happens to these figures, can be known. I'm jumping on a bit further. We're now at the top of Mount Purgatory. This is another wonderful image by Gustave Doré, where Dante encounters the figure that guides him through the earthly Eden, which is at the top of Mount Purgatory. And this is where time begins to shift for Dante. He's been bathed here in a river of forgetting, the Lethe, and that enables him to not be so completely tied to the past out of fear, but more able to be in the present and to begin to move into the fluidity of the paradise, where time can shift, and where through choice we can move across different notions of time, from the chronos through the kairos to the eternitatis, to the eternal. That's one of the things which he knows in Eden. And he also learns something which I think is really important for us now, which is, it's important not just to be against things, but even more strongly to know what you're for. You must know what you love so that you can not be consumed by what you hate. You must learn how to speak positively of life so that then you don't just become encumbered with critique. You know, if you become obsessed with evil or what you think is going wrong and darkness, it's likely to overtake you, consume you. So whilst I'm sure that critique is necessary, fostering the capacity to love, to be delighted, to know the positive, to have the full vision of life, spiritual intelligence tells us that now. And I feel this is a really fundamental issue now, actually, even amongst those who, as it were, you might regard as on your side. You know, I think things like conspiracy theories and so on are a confusion here, when what is actually true and good and delightful is being lost sight of, becoming too entangled. And Dante must learn that as well if he's to enter paradise. Because one of the things about paradise is that it's not that difficult things don't happen. It's not even that harsh things aren't said, but the difficulty and the harshness is never eclipsed by the light and the life. You know, Beatrice routinely condemns popes, for example, in paradise, quite as much as Virgil had done in the Inferno. Dante goes blind at one point in the paradise and he becomes confused, but that blindness and confusion is never to the detriment of his sense of what's happening to him, which is entering more deeply into the light. So spiritual intelligence knows that too. So here we are now into the paradise proper, and I wanted to touch on a few key moments in the paradise. Here he is in the sphere of the moon, and what he learns in these planetary spheres is that the light that the different planetary spheres convey helps illuminate a certain kind of light of his intelligence. You know, there's a reason why this word light is both used to describe something in the external world and in the interior world. And we talk about being enlightened, or a light went on inside, as much as we talk about the daylight or the moonlight. And in the sphere, therefore, of the moonlight, of the heavenly moon, Dante learns that subtle lights can be far more important than blazing lights. This image here by Giovanni di Paolo, one of the wonderful later medieval illustrations to the Divine Comedy, conveys an awful lot. But just look at the figure there stood in front of a candle with 3 mirrors in front of him. And Beatrice and Dante have a huge conversation about reflections and images and light and so on. But the sum of it is that Beatrice says to Dante, look, you've got to learn to look at what looks like the least promising image, the one that's most distant from you, not just the one right immediately in front of you. If you want to become more intimate with this now region of paradise, you need to learn to follow the subtle light in order to enter more deeply. Because if you just stay with the light that's familiar, then you won't actually go anywhere. And so that's the first lesson which Dante can learn from the moonlight, which, of course, as we know, externally is changeable and is mottled on the surface. It's not just a bright light like the sun. And so the moon and its light can teach us that as well. They then move into the sphere of Mercury. I'm going through the journey quickly, but just to make another point for spiritual intelligence. And in the mercurial light, they learn something else. This is an image by John Flaxman, a contemporary of William Blake, and it shows how Dante and Beatrice here encounter the figure of Theodorus, the great emperor. And he was a marvelous figure, a Byzantine figure, also the perpetrator of great horrors. And what Theodorus tells Dante and Beatrice is that he's now learning to distinguish what he thought to be his earthly glory from the heavenly glory, and how the light that we can create in life relates to the divine light, which is its source, is part of what Dante learns in the mercurial sphere. It can trick us, becoming confused about our light and the divine light. Mercury, the planet itself, is constantly, because it's closest to the sun, getting lost in the solar light before appearing again as its own light on the other side. And so that subtle business about how we share in the divine light is what Dante has to encounter here in the sphere of Mercury. Again, another important lesson for spiritual intelligence, because we are called to be co-creators, to be collaborators. There's the divine spark in us, but we must know what it is to be created and not uncreated too, Dante would say, and that's not always straightforward. They then enter the sphere of Venus, and this is one of Botticelli's marvelous drawings. Botticelli shows all the lights, the souls as flames that they encounter in Venus, and you can see Dante spends a lot of his time gazing into Beatrice's eyes and at her smile as she titrates greater and greater illumination through herself into Dante. And what they particularly learn in the sphere of Venus is that this is the sphere of love, of course, but it's a love that's not ruled by regulations, by moral law. It's a love that draws by passion. And Dante meets a bunch of figures in the sphere of Venus that he thought probably would be in purgatory because they were great lovers in the pejorative sense on earth. But they tell him that they knew actually the secret heart of love, even as they made mistakes in their love lives. And that's why they can share the Venetian light and show him something of that now. And of course, Dante himself had this in his life because he fell in love with Beatrice. No doubt it was an infatuation and then a very, physical, erotic passion as well. And he's having to learn how love can truly lead him from the initiation of falling love into the love that, well, this is to learn, turns the sun and the other stars. Again, a notion of love and eros that spiritual intelligence can guide us with, rather than just assuming that, sexual love is one thing unto itself. They enter the sphere of the sun, and here they encounter great luminaries of the theological world. Thomas Aquinas is a famous one. Others are there. There's Islamic philosophers here as well as Christian ones, and also Jewish philosophers too. This is part of Dante's universalism starting to appear at this point. And what the luminaries tell him is that whilst they flamed like the sun with great light in their life through their words and through their theological discourse, They also disagreed very profoundly. They disputed. I mean, so much so that two of the figures that they meet here, Thomas Aquinas and Sigar of Brabant, Thomas had actually condemned Sigar as a heretic, in effect, to burning during their earthly life. But now they know something else. They know that the very light which they try to convey through their words and their discourse was the divine light that transcends, but is also present in all the words and all the discourse that different people speak. So that even though they differ on earth and maybe are in fierce combat on earth, you can follow the subtle light and realize that conveys the flaming light of divine truth, that can take on many and diverse forms. Dante learns that in the sphere of the sun as he encounters these different figures. And again, it's something that spiritual intelligence can know. Fundamentalism, you might say, only leads to division and only drags us down. But not by just a bland saying everything is really one, people are all saying the same thing really, but by really understanding what different traditions are saying, by going into them, entering them at their most profound level. That's when the opening up occurs. And Dante learns that in the sphere of the sun. That's another facet of his spiritual intelligence. They enter the sphere of Mars. A lot happens in Mars. Here's Giovanni di Paolo again, just conveying one part of that. Dante learns in the sphere of Mars that he's going to have to go into exile when he returns. He spends the last 20 years of his earthly life, as you probably know, in exile. He has to leave Florence. He ends up in Ravenna, which is where he was buried. And in the sphere of Mars, he has to learn about suffering. And the heart of it is that he at first tries to sort of do a calculation. He tries to say, well, look, I'm in paradise. I know that there's more good than bad at the end of the day. So although I'm going to suffer in the rest of my mortal life, I can sort of hold out for the good. And Beatrice says to him, no, that is to be in a, just hostage to fortune, hoping that your calculation is right, a transactional view of life. And she says, what you must learn is that there's a kind of exile, might be called a dark night of the soul, that is taking you from what you know in order that you might know more. And again, a number of spiritual traditions convey this kind of intelligence, that, some saints would tell you that the worst suffering happens the further you are on the spiritual path. Or you might think of Rumi and Shams and the way that was devastating for Rumi when Shams, his teacher, just suddenly disappeared and he never knew why. Dante must learn that in the Paradise as well, and so understand his exile in a different way. Spiritual intelligence is demanding, Dante learns. They enter then the sphere of Jupiter, and here they see the great angel, the great eagle of Jupiter, shown in Gustave Doré's image here. There's an enormous amount one could say about this, but the thing I wanted to stress for now is that this is the moment when Dante starts to realize that he can't tell the difference between the first person singular and the first person plural. He's not sure now whether the souls are saying I or whether they're saying we. And what's striking is that he has this sense of hearing both the I and the we, even as he sees the individual souls both more and more distinctly as themselves and in this great harmony in this particular moment of the vision, forming the eagle of Jupiter. And this is another thing that spiritual intelligence invites us, guides us towards, that in this great issue about, you might say, the ego and the collective, the individual and the shared, the one and the many. Spiritual intelligence tells us it's when we understand the nature of the individual that we understand the nature of the collective. It's not that one supersedes the other. It's when we understand the nature of the many that the unity actually starts to reveal itself in its truest extent. One can reach for analogies, the music that is many notes that forms a harmony as a whole, because each individual note sounds. that's what the sphere of Jupiter starts to teach Dante. Jupiter is the light of justice, and the light of justice in the medieval sense was really the light of harmony coming together, each having its place and so flourishing to its fullest extent. That's why Jupiter is the light that Dante knows this by. They come then to the sphere of Saturn, and a great ladder descends like Jacob's ladder, and Dante realizes that he's on the threshold of a kind of transition. This is another initiation point, a portal, if you like, and it's the beginnings of them entering the Imperium, the zone where eternity itself is dominant and where gods can be known unmediated. And there's a silence falls at this moment. Again, sort of surprising. You might think that the Divine Comedy in the Paradiso is all music, all light, but there's more diversity and richness and texture in the Paradiso than there has been in any of the other canticles. And so again, I wanted to stress this, and of course, particularly the role of silence. Spiritual intelligence knows and loves words, but knows that words ultimately point beyond themselves, and being open to the edge of words, as Rowan Williams has called it, is fundamental to understanding the meaning of words. And so in Saturn, this transition point, they fall silent. They then enter the highest heavens, coming towards the denouement. Here's William Blake's wonderful image of Dante and Beatrice, accompanied by Peter, James, and John. And Dante must praise faith, hope, and love. The three saints are associated with the three Christian virtues. It's sort of presented as a sort of playful test. Can Dante speak with his own voice about faith, hope, and love, not just parrot what he's been told about them? But it's deeper than that, because he must show that he can sing with his own voice and so delight all the lights and the saints and the angels around him, and so show that he is ready to fully participate in that which the saints and the angels and the light around him know. His voice is able to match their voice and so share and delight in the one voice. And that's the kind of thing which is starting to happen now. It's not a test, as artificial intelligence might treat it. You're right or wrong, a binary option. It's not even as an emotional intelligence might treat it. Do you know something of this? Can you feel its resonance within you? No, it's the fullest participation. Are you one with this light and life? And Dante shows that he is, after some ups and downs. I'll leave you to find that out if you don't know already. And then the full diversity and the unity of the heavens opens up to him. Gustave Doré's wonderful image here of the hierarchy of the angels. The many first show themselves to Dante, emerging from this infinitesimal point of light that he somehow knows is the source of all things as well. The tremendous ecstatic vision opens up, but it's not the end. And at one point, Dante uses a reference to Neptune, which is shown here again in Giovanni de Paolo's image, to show that there was an even deeper transition that he had to undergo. The story goes that when the Argonauts sailed across the Black Sea, as you can see there in the first ship, the Argo, Neptune, beneath the waves, looked up and hadn't the slightest idea what he was seeing, because it was the first ship. And he had no consciousness that could interpret the shadows that were moving on the surface of the waves. And the myth is that Neptune then spent many centuries trying to work out what he was seeing. His consciousness had to change to meet the new presence in the form of the Argo. And Dante says, this is what it was like for me at this point. My consciousness itself had to change to meet and match the consciousness that I was now being presented with so powerfully and so presently. Again, something that spiritual intelligence knows. It's not just the objective stance, as if we're somehow separate, looking on what we're studying. No, we must change if we're to know the fullness of reality opening up before us, like Neptune. And here's how Dante describes it. This is a wonderful image by Monica Beisner, I think the greatest living illustrator to the Divine Comedy, showing Beatrice and Dante here approaching the white rose now at the culmination of the Paradiso. And Dante says this, he says, well, he has someone say this to him actually, but this is the explanation he starts to unfold. A ray of God's light focuses on me and penetrates the light, enwombing me, whose force once joined to that of my own light lifts me above myself until I see the primal source from which such might is born. And what Dante's saying here is that he now knows that the light which was always within him is being met by the divine light that's enwombing him. And there's almost a kind of an inversion that now is the divine inversion of the satanic inversion that he knew in the Inferno, the original Enantiodromia. He's now moving towards the light that is now becoming the light that always was the light that was within him. And these metaphors of enwombing and that which is within meeting that which is without, and then that which was within being known as always that which was without, the primal source. He starts to understand these things. This was a perception that wasn't just Dante's at the time. I wanted just to touch on the Beguines, who along with the Beggars and other mystics of the time were very much onto this. Extraordinary movements, actually. Very, very widespread across Europe. Here's Katherine of Genoa making this comment where she says, God is my being, my me. I will have nothing to do with a love that would be for God or in God. I cannot bear the word for or the word in, because they denote something that may be in between God and me. Spiritual intelligence knows this. But you notice that there's still a keen sense of Katherine of Genoa here. She's not saying I was lost, I was annihilated, the divine light consumes me. There can be experiences of that, but I think Dante and others would say that's just part of this much greater experience that spiritual intelligence can teach us. Another image that Dante uses, which is very wonderful, is he says it's a bit like a mountain that's reflected in a perfectly still lake. And as you look on this image, you begin to wonder which is the source and which is the image, or you realize that the source and the image have come together in a beautiful new whole that is what the original source was, but is also greater than what the original source was because of the presence of the image. And that's another metaphor that Dante uses to describe now what he's understanding about our relationship with the divine, that though we're born as created beings, as the church fathers put it, were created to become uncreated. And that's a bit like the beauty of a source and an image, Dante says. He's moving higher now, we're near at the end, and just to mention a couple more things which are particularly important in the Christian understanding of spiritual intelligence. The Trinity has been important for Dante since fairly high at Mount Purgatory, but now it comes most clear to him. And this is the way that Christianity talks about unity. It argues that actually Trinitarian ways of talking about unity are richer ways than just talking about monadic unity. Because what you have in Trinitarian unity is dynamism, so that, as it were, the one moves out of itself into another, but that's always itself too in this divine realm, in the infinite realm. And therefore, this expansion becomes part of the extraordinary nature of the oneness, of the unity. And so Dante says that within this Trinitarian understanding, my desire now was no longer the desire born of lack, wanting to know. It was the desire and the love that's born of knowing that the pleasure and the joy and the wisdom and the intelligence and the knowledge has no end. It's dynamic, it's moving, it's growing all the time, not beyond itself, but more and more into itself. Nicholas of Cusa, he has a lovely image that I think conveys this as well. He talks about, imagine a spinning top. And you'll know that a spinning top, the faster it spins, the more stable it becomes. And he says, God is like that. God is spinning at infinite speed eternally. And so is not only infinitely moving, but completely stable, completely one, completely grounded at the same time. The two have come together, you know, the coincidence of opposites and so on. And that's part of the Trinitarian understanding. Another image that becomes hugely important to Dante is the image of the Virgin. She leads him into the final sense of the divine. And this is, Greek Orthodox icon of the Ho Patera, if you can just see the Greek there in the middle of by Mary's shoulders. And this is Greek for more spacious than the heavens. And this is Dante now understanding the contemplative life. As Mary bore Christ, who was not only a child in her womb, but was also the Logos that forms the heavens. So this is part of our calling at this highest level, spiritual intelligence tells us, that we both know of the divine being born in us and of our oneness with the cosmos, that through our sharing in the divine is itself the source of the cosmos. These lovely inversions and fractal senses become more important to Dante at this moment, right at the end now, until finally, as the famous last words put it, he knew himself to be spinning like a perfect wheel with the love that moved the sun and the other stars. And he has this extraordinary moment where he sees the divine plenitude and knows that the human plenitude is one with it. There's the divine within us, but as church fathers and others have written, there's also the human in the divine, and no doubt the whole of creation as well. This is the richness of the non-dual vision, to use another language, another tradition that Dante shows us, that his spiritual intelligence is revealed to him. Not in an instant, in Dante's case, some people do have that experience, but through this gradual unfolding, which, if you remember, began in the dark woods, involved the descent down Inferno, up Mount Purgatory, and then through this gradual unfolding of the Paradiso, which has the advantage that his spiritual intelligence becomes more and more cognizant to him, so that, of course, he can do this wonderful thing and write the Divine Comedy, so that we can learn not just what happened to him, but also learn of spiritual intelligence for ourselves. He was guided, and he can be our guide.